you've transcended a liminal threshold into History Fuzz, a realm of contemplative inquiry in which leading researchers discuss the motivations, tools and skills of the skywatchers, surveyors, architects and builders who delineated monumental landscapes with awe-inspiring structures, enshrining their diverse cosmic chronicles in stone. I'm your host, Ashley Cowie. You can unlock videos, maps, articles, and enjoy early ad-free new episodes by becoming a member on historyfuzz.com, where you can also apply to join our team exploring and filming archaeology documentaries in the Andean highlands of Colombia. Professor Timothy Pauketat, Director of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, is a leading authority on Mesoamerican and Southwestern connections, and in this conversation he reveals the secrets of Cahokia, the major precolonial ceremonial center located near St. Louis, Missouri. Journeying into indigenous American culture's astronomy and sacred geography, Timothy presents an astronomically aligned landscape reflecting the Milky Way and key stages of the lunar cycle. And he also discusses the possible functions of the enigmatic Birdman Tablet, the controversial Chaco Meridian, and the role of frog sounds in ancient rituals and climate. Timothy, the first interview for this season of the History Fuzz podcast was with Stephen Lexon. And halfway through that interview, when we were talking about the Chaco Meridian, a very nuanced, specific part, he said, I have to speak to you. And I've got a note of what that is. We can bring it up later. So 4 days later, I interviewed Dr. Rich Friedman. He also referred me to you. And then last week, I was talking to Dr. Robert Weiner. And I put to him that a meridian could not have been extended from Aztec to Palenque in the south because they would have been attacked at every stop. Yet you know where he hit me back with was your research showing that people could get permission, if you like, to seek passage through indigenous territories. So I have 3 interviews, which the audience has already heard, which has led me to you. Do you have any comments on these 3 gentlemen, good or bad?
I'm honored. They're friends and colleagues, so they can be excused, for their poor judgment.
Well, they certainly use you when they're up against walls anyway. They just sort of refer to you as if that can't be wrong. We'll find that out. I'd like to begin with your 2013 book, An Archaeology of the Cosmos, Rethinking Agency and Religion in Ancient America. I'd like you to tell me what inspired you to write that book after so many years in the field.
A good question. And it actually was an experience in the field that led me to write that book. Now, in addition to a good bit of theoretical rethinking of, the causes and effects of history, but it began with a discovery, a particular semi-subterranean building, which we found when we weren't looking for anything having to do with archaeoastronomy. We were looking just for simple settlements of farmers in a kind of a remote location. And we found, instead of a simple settlement of farmer, some kind of ritual gathering spot where houses were built and then rebuilt in a pattern that suggested an alignment and a realignment, and then alignment and a realignment. And so just back and forth between 2 angles. There was even one building, the one that I alluded to, where they marked the floor in addition to aligning the whole building in a linear fashion. It's a rectangular building, it's aligned to something. And then on the floor was this other azimuth marked, the same azimuth as was elsewhere represented by entire building. So I was scratching my head. A lot of effort went into off cardinal alignments, and there were two of them, and it just bugged me. Initially, I really didn't place a whole lot of stock in archaeoastronomy. I just never really thought about it that much, but that particular discovery made me think about it, and then I realized these were lunar alignments, and that led to the whole book.
Whereabouts in relation to Monk's Mound was the location of that building you referred to that seemed to flicker between azimuths?
It was 12 miles to the east, not in the floodplain in the Mississippi Valley, but in an upland location, low rolling hills where you did have Cahokians setting up farming settlements to feed the city.
Is that area close to the Emerald Mound?
Yes. In fact, the site that I'm talking about is itself called Pfeffer, based on an original landowner. But it's only 3 miles or so from Emerald. So it's in the same environment on a big glacial hill, just like the Emerald site is itself.
Is that building in any way oriented towards Emerald Mound?
Not directly anyway. I've looked at intersite alignments like that, and I played around with those. And there may be some, but the more important and demonstrable alignments are within a site to some sort of celestial, sometimes terrestrial location.
Okay. So what I was picturing there was that perhaps that site was using the Emerald Mound as a marker on the horizon.
No. Oddly, these are two contemporaneous shrine complexes, we call them, because it's a hilltop covered with shrine houses, things that aren't used for long-term residential occupation, but seem to be set up and used for specific ceremonial periods. And they're occupying. You can see one from the other, and so they're both on these high hills, not too far apart. There's a few differences, leading me to think that perhaps there's even some kind of community. One community may be using one versus the other one, and or clans, or some kind of way they're segregating similar activities atop two adjacent hills.
I live in the Andes of Colombia, and throughout my interviews, I've been talking a lot about the cosmology of the Muiscas on the central Andean plain. They were one of the 4 high civilizations, and I live 3 kilometers from their chief temple of the moon that was sacked in 1537. But there's lots of Spanish records here, and what they do is talk about the 2 very defined centers of Muisca territory, and that was the Temple of the Sun to the north and the Temple of the Moon in Chia. Archaeology has shown that the Temple of the Moon in Chia was aligned to where the moon reaches its maximum and minimum standstills, its maximum and minima. Do you see a definition or a difference between temples associated with the sun and temples associated with the moon, depending on orientation?
Yes, I think, and the problem that we have is a lack of standing architecture. So we're dealing with only what's been excavated. Do we have good information about? And then there's lots of unknowns. So I'm sure there's bigger patterns that we aren't yet able to nail down because we haven't excavated those 5 sites in between Cahokia and Emerald, let's say.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. I certainly think, and there's some reason to think now that within the city of Cahokia or between its major precincts, that there is certain buildings are dedicated to the sun or the moon. The moon is pretty clear. The sun is not so clear. There are some that are solstitially aligned, and then there's some that are cardinally aligned, which is probably ultimately a solar alignment.
Yeah.
But the moon stands out because they're off cardinal. The lunar minima and maxima, are kind of odd angles in a flat landscape like Illinois, and so they stand out, and they're also very because I've focused on them a lot. We know that they're very precise.
Mm.
One other thing, I guess I could say, the city plan of Cahokia, and then the plan of a series of outlier shrine complexes, and these outliers are several hundred kilometers away. They now seem to build in multiple alignments. The main shrines, if you will be both aligned in some way to the moon, either minimum or maximum. In one case, I can think of both. Potentially the sun, because there's some cardinal elements to them, and then really interesting, the Milky Way. And the Milky Way in certain latitudes is pretty much at a right angle to some of the lunar alignments. So it's easy for them to build in both. So you get that combination for probably a really powerful shrine, or monument.
I do lots of work, Timothy, looking at the dynastic meridians in Khmer, Cambodia. And I would say a couple of times a month I send and very often get my stuff batted back by Bill Romain.
I know Bill.
Bill's such good sport with me. He's the first to say, that is really good, that's interesting, or you're going too far. Accuracy like this didn't exist. You're overselling it, Ash. Back to the drawing board.
I've had those exact same conversations with Bill, and in many ways, Bill helped me figure out the lunar alignments and that whole problem right as I was working on that Cosmos book.
Mm-hmm.
I had a pretty good sense of what I had, but I didn't know how to. I wasn't as concerned with accuracy as much as Bill insisted that I should be. And so I kind of took a course from Bill after that. He gave me readings. He helped me out on site at the Emerald site, how to, correct your own archaeological grid by shooting to true north and shooting to the sun, that is.
Yeah.
And then he is over the years, he's read what I write, and he'll give me.
The reason I am asking you so much about Emerald Mound since you brought that area up is because, as you know, the axis of Monk's Mound down the Rattlesnake Causeway is off by 5 degrees, yeah? Mm-hmm. And Bill suggests because aligned to a spot in the Milky Way, the summer solstice in 1050 AD.
Yes.
So too is Mound 72 to Emerald Mound 5 degrees offset. So it's your square. Emerald Mound, Mound 72, Monk's Mound is a right angle. It's 5 degrees offset. And I wondered if there were some kind of purpose in trying to associate Emerald Mound with the greater complex through that 5 degrees offset with Mound 72.
To begin to answer your question, I do think, and here's where I wish we had better control over our archaeological complexes and what they're aligned to. I do suspect that what we're seeing with Emerald aligned to a lunar, the big monuments at Emerald are aligned to a lunar maximum. At this other site, the big monuments are aligned to a lunar minimum. At Cahokia, there's this combination. At St. Louis, there's a precinct of St. Louis, which is a little different. In East St. Louis, another precinct of Cahokia is a little different. I suspect, especially since many of the burials in Mound 72 and some other mortuary mounds are aligned to the moon.
Yeah.
The actual individuals themselves are aligned to one or another lunar event. That what we're probably seeing is a circuit that pilgrims would come in and they would go from one place to the next, and you'd get you'd get a different experience for a different purpose at the various stops.
And what you're suggesting is that there's this idea of traveling around the sites to meet different astronomically significant events, perhaps, whether it's sun or moon, or even associated with one of the highest magnitude stars. So do you suggest the landscape was like a theater, if you like?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. And you can see, I mean, there are causeways at Cahokia proper too, where it's clearly about processions, and moving between not just celestial bodies or events, but simple fundamentals like earth and sky, or life and death. And involves these causeways run through water. So you go from dry land and residential area and big monuments through water to a mortuary space that happens to be aligned with the Milky Way, which is in native North American terms, the path of the souls take to go to the afterworld.
But the implication, Timothy, is huge, because if you even establish that there was a lunar religion, if you like, present there, that has enormous cultural implications. For example, here in Muisca, Colombia, in the north, that was the solar religion. Here in the south, I live in the Valley of the Moon. Their entire numerical system, their calendar system, their ritual system was based on the 3 monthly cycles of the moon, the 13 full moons of a year, 20 full moon cycles, and then 37 full moon cycles. And their language that represented different parts of the moon cycle. So you wouldn't there have a mound, maybe with lunar significance, without an entire profound cosmology. And that cosmology would be sewn intricately to the purification and storage of water. Mm-hmm. Like here, the whole cosmology here in the Andes Highlands is about managing water. The sun was associated with gold, Bochica, the male sun god, with gold. Chia, the triple female goddess, with silver, and if there was gushing, charging male rivers coming down mountains, they would deposit silver to feminize it, to balance it. That may have been present in your region. It must have been if there was lunar astronomy and religion.
I definitely think that there is a deep connection in the past and among descendants today, Cahokian descendants, between the moon and water.
Yeah.
Never mind simple things like the moon was viewed as a water bringer, as rain bringer, as were a few other things. And these lunar sites that I was talking about, Emerald and Pfeffer, they're built on what descendants would call water hills. It's big hills with perched water tables that seep water out the sides. Mm. And you get a special kind of ritual, sweat lodges or steam baths built on the circular mounds that overlook the seeps that are all aligned into the moon.
If you don't already know this, you're going to love this. I got a quote for you. What I'll do is I'll put this in the show notes for sure. But in 1980, Dr. André Emmerich discovered within the Muisca mythology that the sunlight was referred to as semen of the sun, while water and emeralds were called tears of the moon.
Oh, that's really nice. That's the same way it's referred to among some of the groups of Cahokian descendants or neighbors, the Caddo in particular.
The moon had the 3 monthly cycles, so a young rebellious mistress of drunkenness was called Waitaka. She represented the waxing moon. Chia was a full moon, fertile goddess. She was worshipped at the full moon. And then Bachwe, there's a whole myth here with the transition of the moon goddess into the earth goddess Bachwe. But within that trinity is the triple moon goddess Chia, and she was worshipped at the central temple, which had outliers numbering 13 outlying temples, or 12 plus the 1, representing the 13 full moons of the year. But the solar religion up north, they had none of this. Their central emblem was the lizard, representing dry, where the central emblem of the lunar religion here, you know what it was, the frog.
Yeah, yeah.
You know it. The high priestess of the moon in Chia was surrounded by 106 priestess astronomers in attendance, and each of them wore emerald and gold frogs. And she was the high priestess, was known as the embodiment of Chia because her son was the ruler, the Zipa. It was a matrilineal hierarchy here, and the next Zipa was from the sister of the current Zipa. So frogs, water, the moon, and dynastic rulership were all one thing here. Do you see any signs of that going on up there?
We have the first three
Okay.
in clear association. The dynastic rulership, I think, was being worked on, and I think it was coming about at Cahokia proper. And then when that fell apart, and then the European colonizers come in, it doesn't really have a chance to continue on a trajectory that you might imagine it would.
There's a fundamental myth that appears here and in Inca Peru, and it's essentially a flood myth, a creation myth whereby the creator god Buchica comes to a flood and he smashes his staff and he relieves it, like the Moses archetype. But it represents foundation. Now, Buchica the sun was married to Chia the moon. Their union was worshipped at the holiest day, which was the eclipse. But in this myth, there's a dark turn at the end where Buchica takes his wife Chia and casts her to the sky to forever fly around the moon as an owl, a white owl. Now, what this actually represents is the collapse of the matriarchal culture and the rise of the patriarchy, the displacement of lunar worship with solar worship. And funnily enough, Buchica is described as white-skinned with a beard, just like Viracocha in Peru. So there's a high chance Buchica represents the coming of the Spaniards with their solar religion and the displacement of Chia. So is there any signs there of an earlier lunar religion and moving through time it converting into solar, or is that looking too far?
No, it's not looking too far. And I've talked to Bill Romain about scrutinizing, across the southeastern part of North America, looking at all the site plans and making a better argument for what I think is an argument waiting to be made, and that is the lunar observations they're old. I mean, in the eastern woodlands, they go back 2,000 years into the Hopewell era, if not even a little before. Then they kind of go away. At least they're not built into the landscape. Maybe they're hidden.
Okay.
And then Cahokia arises, and that those alignments are built into the city and then all of its surrounding shrine complexes and precincts. And Cahokians are very actively carrying this outward, so that their far-flung outposts or shrine complexes are also lunar aligned, sometimes with the other two in addition, the sun and the Milky Way. But Cahokia goes into a pretty steep decline.
When, Timothy? When did it decline?
1300. It's decline. It's pretty well already into that decline. I mean, it starts a little earlier in the 1200s. After that point, neighbors that used to be in some ways beholden to or connected to Cahokia start doing things their own way. And from my point of view, and I've yet to see a really good lunar aligned site after 1300. Instead, you see solar aligned sites, cardinal or solstitial.
Simon Pedro in 1608 recorded that there were more priests in attendance at the Sun Temple in Bojaca than there were priests at Mecca.
Wow.
It seems to be when the cities expanded here, they began importing more, which allowed them to go and do more war and to depend less on agriculture. And I perhaps wonder if the expansion of population centres did away of the requirement for A, the lunar astronomers, and B, the entire religion as a result.
Now, I think, Chaco Canyon in the Southwest has a similar kind of switch from lunar to solar. That is, once Chaco is left behind, the lunar observations are maintained for a while, but then there's another huge series of migrations, and they're completely disappear.
Yeah.
So I think that's more close to the Cahokia story. It's all about people moving, and then they leave. In part, these folks don't have writing, so the writing is in the earth. If you leave the writing behind because you've written it in the earth, and it's like then how do you recreate it? Potentially that's part of it, but also maybe they just easier to lose things in motion. And people in the Mississippi Valley after 1300 were moving and also fighting each other.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to Chaco, I bet.
Can I ask you when the Monk's Mound was built?
It was built between 1050 and 1150. And with a late addition nearer 1200, but that's it. That 150-year period.
I'm going to peel a layer off and we're going to go underneath. I need to ask you about the difference between lunar astronomy and the worship of the moon. They're very different things, whereby the lunar astronomer would need a cardinally aligned building so that he could monitor the moon transiting the meridian, doing away with horizontal problems and variables. So do you find any mounds that are related to the moon that have east-west or north-to-south cardinality, suggesting they were actually lunar observatories? Where was the lunar observations? Where did they get done? Before the worship and before the ritualization of lunar cycles, do you know where the lunar astronomy was perhaps performed?
Oh, that's a good question. No. No is a simple answer. Well, maybe I am being too rash in saying no.
Yeah.
Because a site like Emerald, which is there before Cahokia goes and moves into its urban phase, there's shrines there already. Somebody's already figured out that this is a place to watch the moon, and the hill itself corresponds to a maximum lunar position. Excavations that we did there, and not unlike Cahokia and other big precinct excavations, will have buildings of all alignments.
Yeah, sure.
So there will be a cardinal building. There will be lunar maximum and minimum buildings. There will be solstitial buildings. So
yeah,
I can't assign a specific location. I mean, it's like here's where they figured it out, or here's where they were. But I suspect you're right. It's there, or it's maybe in multiple places.
I'd like to just jump over onto the Birdman Tablet. Have I called it right? The Birdman Tablet?
It's the Birdman Tablet. Mm-hmm. It's one of several, by the way.
Okay, that's even more interesting. I'm going to give you the proposition, and you give me an answer. 10 being, wow, Ash, no one's ever thought that before. It's great. And 0 being, Ash, you're talking a lot of shit. Okay. For the audience, this is a tablet perceived as the carving of a man who's perhaps transitioning into bird with elements of both. But on the other side, Timothy, there's a lattice structure carved, yeah?
Right. Yes.
Have you ever measured the angle of that?
I have not. And now that you mention it, it's like, I'm not sure why I haven't, but I have not.
Now, Tim, I'm going to give you the number, and I just want you to illustrate what that perhaps represents. The creator of the Birdman Tablet chose one angle in the back to define that matrix of lines, and the angle he chose was 53 degrees.
Oh, wow. Really? Well, that's the location of the major lunar standstill moonrise in that latitude. Yeah.
My proposition is this. A surveyor could take it along to a site, and the rope pullers could use that tablet as a model for which to pull A, congruent lunar orientations and alignments. They would be able to bisect parallel lines to create walls so that they were parallel and congruent within a structure, and it could be observed as a geometer rope puller's tool for doing exactly what you said. Well, I'm not going to wait here for 18.6 years for this moon to come to its maximum. What I'm going to do is use this tablet we're going to build today. What do you think?
I immediately want to go to all the other tablets because they all have the cross hatching on one side.
I suggest you do look at those angles, because if you're making such a sacred artifact and depositing it ritually where it was found, it must have, as it's been interpreted, had real significance to the core of Cahokia. And what more significance would there be than the primary lunar maximum axis? Because it's the axis that's important, not an alignment, but the axis. Would you agree?
Yeah. No, that's really fascinating.
If it was 51 degrees, you could say, Ash, I know now, Bill Romain's not going to buy this. Even though it's to the degree, he's not going to have this. He's going to say, looking too far.
Well, he might, and I've been called by him on that in that same way. Of course, he occasionally does the same thing himself. He'll slip into something that's a bit too far.
Yeah.
Now, this may well be. Now, of course, they are adjusting as they move north or south.
Yeah.
You'll find Cahokian sites where it's not 53 degrees. It's 51 or it's 40, whatever. So, but that doesn't necessarily diminish your point.
The point being, like, you had one angle to choose to put in the back of your sacred tablet for inserting in Monk's Mound. What are we going to choose? Well, it's that 53 degrees.
Yeah.
I think you should be looking at those tablets 100 miles to the north and the south, and you perhaps identify a shift in that angle, perhaps.
Yeah, unfortunately, those tablets are almost exclusively in downtown Cahokia. You don't see them in other locations, certainly in other regions.
Knowledge of that one angle gives you enormous power to know how to just snap a finger today, construct the walls of a building that in 9 years came into alignment. That's pure magic.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff.
Isn't it? I couldn't wait to tell you that, but then that takes us on to another level. So, assuming then that the underside with the lines on it represents the moon, the lunar maximum, what then of the Birdman on the other side? Our lunar goddess is worshipped here as an owl. Is that perhaps an owl? Did you have owls up there? Were they significant in the cosmology?
There were owls, and they were significant in the cosmology, as were eagles and falcons. And there's even one slightly post-Cahokian town in southern Illinois that has owl men carving, and they're clearly owls. Now, at Cahokia, you see owls carved, but usually it's a pretty lifelike looking owl.
What about an owl man? What I mean by that is, while all of the goddesses of the moon in South America were female, in Viking, in Norway, for example, the moon was known as Mani, a male moon god, and Invictus Sol was the female sun god. So I just look at that and thought, what if we have lunar geometry on the back? Perhaps he represents some form of ruler that associated with the moon.
I think it wouldn't necessarily have to be an owl, because the other thing to see on that, not that tablet, but a couple other tablets, is pole symbolism. So these are pole climbers, and there was a pileated woodpecker on one of them, next to the pole. So and the pole is a kind of a wind symbol as well. There's like wind symbolism that decorates the pole in this and in other Mississippian artwork elsewhere. So my feeling had been that you're looking at a Birdman of some kind. And the sky is what is the important thing. They're showing you a connection from the earth to the sky via the pole and the Birdman, whatever it is.
So what you're saying is that the Birdman might represent what's known here as the shamanic transition where the shaman travels on the axis mundi of the mound. And this is perhaps a symbol of him traveling the axis mundi, the winged man, if you like.
And the whole ritual may be imported from Meso America, where you still have pole flyers, and they're bird men hanging upside down, in some of those rituals that I've seen, and so we don't think we had that kind of pole ceremonialism before Cahokia, and then you've got it and the birdmen and lunar symbolism, and I mean all the whole shebang.
Do you see any propensity in the artifacts or material culture relating to the number 13? For example, a solar mask here will have a circle with the north, south, east, and west, the cardinal points, but generally lunar symbolism has the center moon representing 1 and 12 outliers. So that's 13 circles. Do you see any usage of the number 13 in arts and crafts?
Not consistently. No. I mean, the best case is Emerald, where you have a hilltop with 12 mounds and then a 13th mound at a right angle off on another hill. But that's it. And so it's hard to replicate it. That there are one of the mass graves in Mound 72 are 13 women, but it's kind of, again, that's it. And so it's hard to draw connections, between the isolated instances.
Are there any records of what type of calendar was used at different periods? Are there any records at all of the types of calendar?
No records. Descendants from Wisconsin into the plains use calendar sticks and marked off years and the full moons. But that's it. I mean, so much is unknown. Cahokia itself is, as far as we know, we being non-native archaeologists, is not ever mentioned in oral histories of descendants. Now, it may be there, but it was pretty thoroughly erased, the memory of it, seemingly.
Yeah.
Forget records. I mean, we don't even have stories. Yeah.
You mentioned Meso America 10 minutes ago, and I was about to jump in with something, and I thought I'd keep it back. Reference the Chaco Meridian. The suggestion by Dr. Lexon is that it was extended south about 600 kilometers to Paquime in Mexico. I took the liberty of extending the meridian south from Monk's Mound. The Monk's Mound longitude is 90.06 west, and I found that it terminates on Edsna, one of the first temples of the Itza family in Mexico. It is on the same longitude, Edsna, and Monk's Mound share the same longitude. Do you think that's beyond the realm of possibilities, that they were sharing the same longitude meridian? What do you think of that, coincidence or otherwise?
I think coincidence.
Sure.
I think the span is too great and the Cahokian experiment too short to have developed that level of detailed understanding. I mean, they knew things were, I'm sure that they knew there were these great complexes to the south.
Sure.
But was there enough time for them to develop that kind of understanding, and then also happen to place, Monk's Mound right where it should be at the very beginning of that experiment?
Oh, okay. First of all, before I ask you this, so I know how nuanced to get, are you aware of the general research regarding the Chaco Meridian?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. From the foundings of the Chaco Meridian, when the North Road was being progressed north, there are malalignments. It's not true north to south by sometimes 4 degrees. And then it gets to Salmon Site, and that's the last site before Aztec ruins. It is within a 20-meter variance from the tip of Mount Wilson, 100 kilometers to the north. The tallest mountain in that Chaco landscape is directly north from Aztec, and that meridian is what extends to Palenque. That there is to less than half a degree of accuracy, and I suggest this, that there was a notion of north, and that it had perhaps been ritualized, and it was seen as the fixed northern point in an otherwise wild universe. But it seems to me when they founded Aztec ruins that they did that with a deliberation to finally come perfectly south of Mount Wilson, and that line is a true astronomer's meridian that could be used for cartography, i.e. going south. They could extend that south because they had Mount Wilson as a backsite. As they were going south, you could sight on Wilson. What do you think of that? Because I think it supplies a loose accuracy towards the north and then an adherence to a meridian with Mount Wilson.
Oh, I think that what you just described is much more historically accurate to how human beings, they're always realigning themselves. It's not alignment is not a one-time thing. It's alignment is a continuous process. Given the complexity of the history of the landscape of the Southwest, you're going to have workarounds.
Yes.
And I think the fact that they could get Aztec in place and copy the basic layout of the center of Chaco, and yet realign themselves to Mount Wilson makes perfect sense. And well, direct experiential connections matter a whole lot. If you can see Mount Wilson, can you see it from Aztec?
The north of Aztec is a bluff. Standing on that bluff, there's a platform, and that's where you can see Mount Wilson from.
Yeah. Okay.
But the point I think here being is we can then use Mount Wilson to extend south symbolically, ritually, and as a chronometer, so they knew they were on the south line. But I think it's by using Mount Wilson that they could get that first 40 kilometers of the journey south out of the way. And once they had determined that meridian, they knew going south out with the line of sight of Mount Wilson that they had their alignment. Steve gets criticized for the inaccuracies in the Chaco Meridian, but what I suggested to Dr. Friedman is Steve admits there are these inherent inaccuracies in the first 7 marks on that meridian going north. But what that does then is it shows that establishment of Aztec ruins was within an incredible degree of accuracy to what suits the cosmological interpretation of all Native American cultures. They always placed, and I say always because you'd have to present me with one that didn't use mountains to the east and west or the north to align their sacred sites. It was so important cosmologically. Steve's probably absolutely accurate with that Chaco Meridian, and I've looked at it back and forth and up and down and questioned it and said, if you look at the whole thing, it's really inaccurate. Don't look at the whole thing. These are people moving and generation after generation and tightening up. Tim, I'll let you talk. I'm sick of the sound of my own voice again.
I'll switch back into the Mississippi Valley, where I did search for such interregional kind of alignments or directionality. Yeah, it's tougher there, in part because the Mississippi is north-south and it bends. And if you're going to build a town, you want to try to be in that Mississippi Valley for obvious production reasons. So it doesn't necessarily work as nicely as the Chaco Meridian, and I'm kind of a believer in that for the very reasons that you just laid out, and also because the native Puebloan people do move, and they talk about moving directionally. It's not like it's inconsistent at all.
Yeah.
There's less of that. That kind of oral history is not a part of most descendant groups that I engage. And then so looking at the archaeology, it's also hard to make that alignment. There was an early case where I thought maybe the Angel site, which is a place that Bill Romain has worked at, and is similar Milky Way and lunar alignments. It comes close. Where it is in the Ohio River comes close to being along a minimum moon set position. It and Cahokia, not quite though, and I don't remember how many degrees, a couple degrees off. And I thought that in part because you can see that that place was founded right after Cahokia took off, And given the alignments that are built into it, I thought maybe people from Cahokia founded this place and they did it, moved back and forth between the two during the season of a lunar minimum. But that's it. That's the only one that I even played around with that seemed to have some legs.
Do you not feel that because they took the liberty to align Monk's Mound and the Rattlesnake Causeway 5 degrees off north, that shows pure ritualization of a site, as if the whole thing is ceremonial, because a meridian that's 5 degrees off doesn't serve very well to do any kind of calendrical predictions, does it?
No. Now you know that there is something not reported yet at the end of that Monk's Mound to Rattlesnake alignment. If you follow that out, right on the 5 degree, it's actually a 4.98 or something like that, is another ancestral burial mound on the bluffs, on the high ground overlooking the floodplains.
Which number? Is it 64? The true Rattlesnake Mound?
No, it's beyond Rattlesnake. It's on the bluffs. It's not part of the Cahokia site. It doesn't have a number.
Okay.
It was noticed in the 20s as being in alignment with Monk's Mound, and sure enough, it's as an ancestral burial mound. It could have been quite powerful, something that you wanted to connect to your living city, to the ancestors, and then beyond it, of course, is the Milky Way.
So Bill Romain suggested the Rattlesnake Causeway was the path of the soul, the path from here to death, if you like.
Right.
What you're suggesting then is that Rattlesnake Mound perhaps doesn't represent the terminus or the other world, that perhaps this extension further beyond represents the place you dare go.
Right. And I don't know that Bill knows this yet. It's just a paper that's coming out, but I think he'd agree with it.
You've only got to question what lies to the north on that same extrapolated alignment, don't you? Have you looked?
Nothing.
Nothing now.
Yes, there are bluffs up there, but no major mounds. There are mounds all to the east, aligning the bluffs, and there may be some in important positions, but not quite like that one to the south. Now, of course, they're not really looking at the northern leg. They're not aligning much at Cahokia to the northern end of the Milky Way on the evening of the summer solstice. They're aligning everything to the south, so only looking to the south makes sense. And that mound faces south.
Yes.
Whereas in other Cahokian locations, there's one we're working on in the state of Mississippi. They're looking north at the northern end of the Milky Way at the same time, this evening of the summer solstice. And so it's a different angle that happens to be the right angle of a lunar minimum at that position.
Wow. In South American cosmovision, in the north and the south of the Milky Way, there's 2 points. I believe they're black constellations here, but one was regarded as where water and us came in, and the one in the south was where water and us went out. I wonder if perhaps you're seeing the buildings to the line to the north and to the south, perhaps indicating these 2 important points on the Milky Way.
You're asking really interesting questions that are going to make me go back and look again. You could be right. There certainly could be something.
Monk's Mound could be the point in the north, and this one extended could be the southern point. So the alignment represents the Milky Way on Earth.
Yeah.
Not just a path or a causeway following the alignment, but actually stars on Earth, as above, so below, in the most profound way.
Right. Well, this has been really interesting.
I must admit, we've gone completely off-piste from what I sent you in a good way. Let me cut to this. I'm going to pull you back to the Chaco Canyon. The myth associated with the gambler, where the gambler arrives in the Chaco Canyon and then he does terrible things to the people do terrible things to him. Then they fire him in an arrow to the south. Can you tell me where that myth is associated with? Because I suggest if it's Aztec, that myth is referencing the South Meridian, that arrow. And where did he land? Where was he fired from? Are you aware of any associated topography or locations? Is there anything in mythology that says he landed here or he was fired from here?
That's beyond me. And for Chaco, that's a question for Rob or Steve. I don't know that one.
He said that the mythology says that when the gambler was fired, it ends in Casas Grandes to the south, which is a thing of beauty. But if we could establish that the myth associates that the firing of the gambler with Aztec, therein you have, just like what you have here, mythologies with an entire topographical, geographical, geodetic layer beneath that myth.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, much like my mention of writing in the landscape, right?
I think that's a thing of beauty. The reason I think that's a beautiful way to look at it is because I asked Rich Friedman, when you look at the Chaco Canyon and indeed Cahokia, you're measuring a building with an alignment, and that's where the focus is given. That's all we can do as a human with our brain, is focus on a given task. But what you're actually perhaps looking at is like a fragmented jigsaw of 500 years of pieces and bits. And it must be not a nightmare, you're good at it, but it must be one of the primary jobs is to figure out layers. What was done first? What was done next? And I think it's remarkable that you can tell a building was oriented to minor and lunar standstills repeatedly by different generations.
Yeah. And much of our conversation, I've been thinking to myself, even about the Birdman Tablet, I think about dates. Like, oh, yeah, well, okay, the dating doesn't quite work. Or I wonder if the dating works, or maybe we're making assumptions. So I think about that all the time. And you're right. That you have to go into the weeds to be able eventually to put this big picture together. And the weeds are so tough because so many people want to argue with you there in the weeds. Like, oh no, how do you know that? How do you know this one dates, before that other one, and it was aligned to this or that?
And even at a professorial level, when I talk about solar equinoxes and solstices, everybody engages. But if I start going into how far the moon moves on the horizon on any given day, you see a lot of academics and their faces drain and they go white because it's a lot to visualize as the moon cycle. Would you agree? It doesn't come natural. There aren't 4 cardinal points. It does.
Oh yeah.
It would take a tablet with the lines marked on it, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. It's also a lot of even good archaeoastronomers have a difficulty with the moon because they ask the wrong question to begin with. They ask, well, why would they do that? I mean, what practical reason would they have for even caring about the moon's position at all? And that's the wrong question, because the practicality that's being referred to by that archaeoastronomer is not at all what was the concern of the person in the past. Where it was much more about it's a living deity or a spiritual force in the air. And of course you have to watch it because you have to track all of such things to understand your own place, in the world that is in motion. And that's a tough one for scientists to grasp.
I'm going to use our last 15 minutes on a dimension of Southwest archaeology that I seldom hear about, but had the pleasure of discussing with Dr. Weiner. I want to talk to you about frogs.
Yeah.
And the reason is because I live on what was an indigenous farm, and we have a 400-year-old Spanish well in my garden. And I have hundreds of frogs. So what I'm getting is an experience of what the indigenous Muiscas witnessed. Now, Timothy, during lunar maximum and minimum, the tides are displaced more. So certain species of frogs are moved into migration patterns earlier during the maximums. On a daily cycle, I can tell when it's going to rain exactly 6 minutes before it rains by listening to the frogs. They switch on 6 minutes before. But I can also tell when the dry season's going to turn to wet because the frogs start making their noise 3 weeks before the rain even comes. So, I also know that during the brightest moon, frogs can see migration routes and canals linking from well to well, and they come alive under moonlight, the migration paths. Their sounds get louder and richer and higher pitched during the mating season. So, what I'm trying to say here is, in my Westerner perspective, if you blindfolded me tonight, I could tell you roughly what stage of the month the moon was in by the sound of the frogs. Likewise, you could put earmuffs on me. If I can see the moon, I can tell you if my garden's loud or not. Now, Cahokia, swamps, agriculture, frogs. They had wells of the moon here, Timothy. Wells of the moon are circular, dry wells without a spring underneath, clay bottom, that the farmers kept frogs in as chronometers so they could make predictions. And I saw you in a presentation saying that all of the Cahokian sites had these circular baths or saunas or steam rooms, and I thought to myself, I've got to ask Timothy if he thinks these could possibly be frog wells to be used to calculate lunar time.
Now, those aren't frog wells because they're not dug down below the ground, so they're not deep. They're right on the surface. But there are lots of circular pits.
Really?
Mostly archaeologists assume they're for storing food. But I myself have seen in excavating these things and then going back sometime later in the season that they're occupied by frogs.
There you go. Right, my mother-in-law lives in the front of our lot, and they have this dip in the road that water gathers in when it's the rainy season. And I can hear them on my right, and I can hear them on my left communicating with each other. And I'll say, just going to be man to man with you, Tim, I'll very often say to Natty, my goodness, they're getting horny. And then in the morning, an entire well will have emptied, but then the one over there's like an orgy the next night. It's like, oh my goodness, the only thing missing is guitar music. And it's deafening at night. You can't hear yourself at night with these frogs.
Yeah.
But I think the correlations between the frogs and the moon cycle is perhaps an entirely new volume of Cahokian archaeology that really should be looked at because they are central connections with water. Frogs.
Yeah. And certainly that Cahokian landscape would have been the soundscape would have been so much. You'd probably have, I don't know how to describe it, but you don't get it anymore today because so many of those swamps and lakes are drained, but you still get it some. And I live next to a pond across the street, and I pay attention to the frogs. It's not quite, I'm sure like it was, but I would agree that there are connections to be made, and frogs are super important. And by the way, those circular buildings, those steam baths that you just made reference to, are often at the end of a linear arrangement, a causeway or some other mound.
Really?
That goes through water, right? So that
okay,
because of course, if it's a sweat lodge, then you have to get water to actually conduct the ritual inside of the sweat lodge itself. So you're going to be processing back and forth between the water and the circular building potentially through frog country, through all that audible richness, that would be there.
I was wondering if the roads that are defined in the Chaco Canyon, which appear to have no end, they seem to stop in the middle of a landscape with no obvious terminus. I wondered if those were quite simply ponds where the pilgrim, maybe, because if you're walking along a straight road with no water at the sides, there's no sound. But
yeah.
You're going to hear it a kilometre distant. You're going to hear those frogs starting perhaps at a pond that no longer exists.
This is not so unlike Rob Weiner's idea that those roads were occasionally built to hold water in certain periods.
What I should be doing is phoning Rob Weiner going, Rob, I've got it. I know what your Chacoan roads are. They're frog migration paths. And so the water lies in them, and under the moon the frogs can see where to go, but he's just not going to have it, is he?
He might. We've talked about frogs and roads and water. Yeah.
For 4 years I passed my frog pond with a torch at night, so they know when that torch passes this guy doesn't eat us or kill us. But see, if I go like that,
They shut up.
I feel really tough, Timothy. The Beastmaster. Timothy, I'm conscious that we're almost at your time, so what I'd like to do here is say I still have so much to talk to you about, and if you were up for it, maybe in season 2, sometime at the beginning of next year, I could get you back on to talk about some more of these lunar aspects.
Let's do that. Let's do season 2, and I'll come prepared to talk more about frogs too, and maybe these cross-hatched tablets. I will look.
Please do, and the proposition is it would be set on a post in the middle of a building being built, and it would enable the rope puller to actually pull a string across that tablet and post in. I think it's a functional geometer's building tool, so they could refer to it and true up lunar orientated buildings at any time in the moon cycle, always been able to target in on the key dates.
It will be even stronger if there are other tablets with that same angle. Yeah. Okay, to be continued.
Thank you again so much for coming on. It's going to make a fascinating episode, and thanks for responding to what the other interviewees suggested I ask you about.
Oh, my great pleasure.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, drop a 5-star review, or share it with a friend. And you can get in touch with me through historyfuzz.com.